Okay, let's unpack this. Our brains are, well, constantly working behind the scenes, right? Taking shortcuts.
Mm-hmm. All the time. Just to make sense of everything coming at us.
Exactly. And these shortcuts, they're necessary, sure, but they can also really influence how we process information.
Yeah, and shape the decisions we make, often, without us even realizing it's happening.
And that's really where understanding cognitive biases comes in, isn't it?
It is. These aren't necessarily flaws, more like uh, predictable patterns in how we think. Mental habits, almost.
Habits that lead us to certain conclusions or choices.
Precisely. And they play out everywhere. Big ways, small ways. The source material you shared has some really compelling global examples right at the start.
Those examples really do grab you immediately, like the point about voters in India,
Hmm.
primarily seeking out news that confirms their candidate is doing well, basically filtering out anything that doesn't fit.
Yeah, that's a classic example, a perfect illustration of one of these shortcuts in action.
Or the street vendor example from Nairobi.
Ah, yes, the anchoring effect.
Right, where that first price mention just kind of sticks. It heavily influences the final deal.
It really does. Even if that first number was, well, a bit arbitrary. It's surprisingly hard to break free from that initial starting point.
And then there's the example of residents in Nairobi maybe overreacting to flood risk
Yeah.
after a big publicized disaster.
Exactly. That vivid event, it's so easy to recall, right? So it makes future flooding feel much more likely than the statistics might actually suggest.
So the memory availability biases their perception of risk.
That's the availability heuristic right there. We also see it in that example from Peru with the insurance options.
Ah, yeah. Where people chose to completely eliminate a small risk in one go.
Mm-hmm. Even if there was another option, maybe statistically better, that reduced a bigger risk significantly overall. There's just something really appealing about getting rid of a risk entirely.
That guaranteed elimination, even if it's not the most logical overall choice.
Right. And another one that stood out from the sources, highlighting that perception gap, people in Greece worrying disproportionately about plane crashes.
Oh, right. Despite the fact that driving is statistically way, way riskier every single day.
Exactly. The dramatic, rare event just looms larger in our minds than the mundane, frequent one.
These are all just fantastic examples of how our brains favor these quick, intuitive paths, heuristics and biases.
Over the slower, more analytical thinking. So our mission today, really, is to take a deep dive into these common mental shortcuts.
Understand what they are, maybe a bit about why they work.
Yeah, see them through these global examples and explore how they actually influence our thinking and choices day to day.
Let's do it. So, where should we start this exploration?
Well, a really fundamental one covered extensively in the material is confirmation bias.
Okay. That's the one where we tend to favor information that fits with what we already believe, right?
Pretty much. You seek it out or you interpret things in a way that confirms what you already suspect.
Right.
Think of it like having a mental filter, and it's slightly tilted towards information that fits your current view.
Okay.
Your brain just finds it easier, more comfortable, I suppose, to process stuff that confirms what's already stored in there.
Which means you pay more attention to it, give it more weight.
Exactly. And you remember it better, too, while maybe downplaying or even just, well, ignoring evidence that contradicts your ideas.
The source material mentions research on this going way back, and that it's still being confirmed by recent studies, too. So it's not just a hunch, it's a well-documented pattern.
Oh, absolutely. It's very well documented. A clear example from the material is, say, someone who believes smoking isn't that harmful.
Okay.
They might latch onto health stats that seem to support that view, maybe an odd study, or just an anecdote about their grandpa who smoked till 90.
Right, while ignoring the mountain of evidence showing the risks.
Precisely. And this gets amplified hugely now, doesn't it, with the internet?
Oh, for sure. Social media feeds, they're often designed to show you stuff you'll agree with.
Mm-hmm. Creating those feedback loops, those echo chambers.
Yeah, where your existing beliefs just get reinforced over and over, even if they're based on, well, misinformation.
Because you're constantly seeing confirming views and rarely getting challenged, that selective exposure is key to how confirmation bias works online.
And the material points out it's not just us regular folks. Even experts can fall into this, like doctors.
Yeah, that's a sobering point. A doctor forms an initial hunch about a diagnosis,
Right.
and they might inadvertently focus on symptoms or test results that fit that first idea, maybe
Wow.
overlooking things that point somewhere else.
Wow. So it can affect anyone, really.
It really can. It's a powerful reminder.
It sounds incredibly difficult to counteract then. The source material notes it's notoriously hard to debias this without very deliberate effort.
It does require conscious work, fighting that natural tendency for things to just fit. Okay, moving to a different kind of shortcut. Let's look at anchoring.
Anchoring,
Yeah.
right, like that first price in Nairobi we mentioned. That initial bit of information just has too much influence.
Exactly. It acts as a starting point, an anchor.
Yeah.
And then any adjustments we make tend to stay too close to that initial anchor.
Even if the anchor itself is completely arbitrary.
That's the fascinating part. The classic experiment mentioned in the sources, Kahneman and Tversky's Wheel of Fortune study from '74.
Oh, yeah. Tell us about that again.
Well, people spun a wheel, got a random number, then they had to estimate something totally unrelated like the percentage of African countries in the UN.
Okay.
And even though they knew the wheel number was random, it massively skewed their estimates. A high number on the wheel led to a high estimate for the percentage.
Wow. So the anchor doesn't even need to be relevant.
Not at all. Which explains why in real-world negotiations, salary talks, buying a car that first offer, or the list price, sets such a powerful anchor.
Mm-hmm.
The material uses that example of an Australian startup pitch. Often they'll open with a really high valuation number.
Ah, to anchor the investors high.
Exactly. It can pull the investor's own internal estimates upwards. Even if they adjust later based on the actual financials, that first big number has already done some work.
It's amazing how one number can have such a gravitational pull on our judgment. Okay, what's next? The availability heuristic.
Right. This shortcut works based on, well, how easily examples of something pop into your head.
Okay.
We tend to judge how probable or frequent something is based on how quickly and vividly we can recall similar events.
So things that are really dramatic or happen recently feel more likely than they actually are.
That's it. Like the shark attack example you mentioned earlier. If you hear a lot about them.
You start thinking they're everywhere, even though statistically they're super rare compared to, say, falling coconuts or something.
Exactly. Or the sources example about Kenyans after dramatic flood news. Those vivid memories make it feel like floods are a constant threat, even if the historical data says otherwise. The ease of recall skews the perception of likelihood.
And social media must just pour gasoline on this fire, right?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Viral stories about, I don't know, airplane turbulence or some freak accident, they stick in your mind.
Yeah. And suddenly flying feels way riskier than it is.
Precisely. The material mentions research finding that social media exposure to danger can really inflate people's perceived risk compared to the actual fatality rates. Our brains just latch onto the memorable story more than the abstract statistic.
It makes sense. A vivid story is just easier to access mentally than a dry percentage. What about the pseudocertainty effect? That sounds tricky.
It relates to how we evaluate risk, especially when decisions have multiple steps or stages.
Okay.
We often really prefer options that seem to eliminate a small risk completely at one stage, even if another option statistically might be better overall because it reduces a much larger risk by a greater amount at a different stage.
Ah, so that insurance example from Peru fits right here.
Perfectly. Choosing to pay extra to get 100% coverage against one specific, maybe small, potential loss.
Instead of maybe paying less for coverage that significantly reduces a bigger, more general risk, but doesn't bring it down to absolute zero.
Exactly. It taps into that desire for certainty, even if it's just in one little area. It feels good to eliminate something completely.
Even if the overall picture isn't really certain or another choice gives a better expected outcome.
Right. This idea comes from Tversky and Kahneman's work on prospect theory, how we frame gains and losses. Pseudo-certainty just highlights how sensitive we are to eliminating risk entirely in one step, even if it's not the most, let's say, strategically optimal move overall.
Got it. So pseudo-certainty is about eliminating risk in one phase. How's that different from ambiguity aversion?
Ambiguity aversion is more about our discomfort with unknown probabilities. We tend to shy away from options where we just don't know the odds.
Even if that ambiguous option might actually have a better potential payoff.
Yeah, we just prefer known odds, even if they're not great odds. It's the uncertainty itself we dislike.
Like the Ellsberg paradox idea, right? Preferring to get on an urn with a known mix of balls over one where the mix is a mystery.
That's the classic illustration. The source gives a great real-world example. African farmers sticking with traditional crops.
Okay, why?
Because they know the typical yield range. They know the risks. They have experience. A new hybrid seed might offer potentially higher yields, sure.
But the outcome feels uncertain. Ambiguous.
Exactly. So that aversion to the ambiguity can lead them to stick with the familiar, even if it means missing out on potential gains. Sticking with what you know.
Right. Sticking with the known, even if it limits the upside. Okay, and lastly, zero risk bias. That sounds straightforward.
It does, but the implications can be surprising. It's a very specific and often irrational preference.
Which is?
The appeal of completely eliminating a very small risk is often disproportionately strong compared to significantly reducing a much larger risk.
So getting rid of a tiny, rare problem feels more important than making a big, common problem much less frequent.
Even if making the common problem less frequent would statistically save way more lives or provide much greater overall benefit, yes.
Wow.
The source uses a really stark example. A health department in Latin America dedicating its entire limited budget to eradicating a very, very rare disease, getting those cases down to absolute zero.
Instead of using that same money to, say, boost vaccination rates for a really common widespread illness.
Exactly. Rationally, boosting vaccinations would prevent far more illness, save more lives. But the idea of achieving zero risk for that one rare disease is just incredibly compelling, even in policy design.
It's seen as a pitfall, then, where the emotional appeal of zero outweighs the rational calculation of actual impact.
Precisely. It's a recognized challenge.
Okay, that's quite sobering. So we've covered confirmation bias, anchoring, availability, pseudocertainty, ambiguity aversion, and zero risk bias. Wow. These are powerful shortcuts.
They really are.
Now, how do we take this knowledge and, well, use it, both in seeing how others might apply it and how we can maybe defend ourselves a bit?
Yeah, the material moves right into that. It talks about applied leverage, how understanding biases can be used, and the defense radar, how we can protect our own thinking.
Okay, let's start with the applied side. Like in design and user experience, you hear about that a lot.
Yes. Designers can definitely leverage biases, often ethically, actually, through things like choice architecture or nudging.
How does that work?
Well, setting default options is a big one. Using anchoring or just inertia to steer users towards choices deemed beneficial. Like making enrollment in a company's retirement savings plan the default rather than opt-in.
So using a bias for good, essentially. Encouraging positive behavior. What else?
Well, using really salient, memorable success stories, tapping into that availability heuristic we talked about.
To promote good habits.
Exactly, like getting people motivated for healthier lifestyles by showcasing compelling transformations. The source rightly notes you need balance, though. You can't only use anecdotes.
Sure, data matters too. What about in education?
Educators often use techniques specifically designed to counteract biases, especially confirmation bias.
Like what?
Things like making students argue against their initial position, play devil's advocate, or assigning research specifically to find evidence that disconfirms their hypothesis. It's about training the mind to look beyond just the confirming stuff.
That sounds like it directly tackles those mental echo chambers.
It does. And in negotiation, obviously, understanding anchoring is huge.
Yeah.
You can strategically use initial offers or recognize when they're being used on you.
Right. The material mentions setting an anchor knowingly, but also flags the ethical side.
Absolutely. Crucial ethical considerations there. And in marketing.
Yeah, they must use this stuff all the time.
They do. Though good marketing, especially around risk or safety, might actually try to counter the availability heuristic.
How so?
By providing clear statistics. Instead of just a scary testimonial about a rare side effect, they might show the actual low frequency, grounding the message in probability, not just a vivid story.
Okay, that gives us a sense of how these biases can be applied. Now, the crucial part. How do we build our personal defense radar? How do we protect ourselves?
Well, the first step is always awareness, right? Which is what we're doing now, this deep dive.
Sure.
So to defend against confirmation bias in your own thinking, you need to make a conscious effort. Challenge your assumptions.
How?
Actively seek out different perspectives. Make a point of reading or listening to sources you know might disagree with you. Talk to friends who you know will challenge your ideas constructively.
That definitely takes active effort, resisting the comfortable path. What about anchoring?
When you see a number that feels like an anchor, a first price, a suggested donation, a salary offer, try to deliberately mentally set it aside for a moment.
Okay.
Ask yourself, what's the real value here for getting that first number? The source had a great tip for sales.
Yeah.
Calculate the original price and ask, would I genuinely buy this at that price based on my actual need? Ignore the flashy discount anchor.
That really reframes it. Good one. And countering the availability heuristic, that feeling driven by vivid memories.
When a dramatic event, a disaster, a crime story makes you feel a risk is much higher than it probably is, make a conscious effort to find the actual data.
Right.
Like the source powerfully suggested.
Mm.
You hear about a plane crash. Counter that availability-driven fear with the statistic. Driving kills far more people than flying every year. Compare the anecdote to the probability.
That comparison does put things in perspective quickly. Okay, finally, defending against ambiguity aversion and zero-risk bias.
Be wary of offers or policies promising guaranteed results or the complete elimination of risk, especially in complex areas.
Because they might be playing on that desire for certainty.
Exactly. Tapping into your desire for pseudo-certainty or that's alluring zero risk. Always try to dig for the details. Ask about probabilities, understand what risks remain or what larger risks are maybe being ignored.
So for big decisions, health, finance.
Yeah, for those high-stakes choices, really trying to consult reliable statistics or experts. Don't just rely on your gut feeling or the perceived certainty of one small part of the picture.
That's a lot of really practical advice coming out of understanding these biases. So we've explored them, seen how they're used, how to defend. How can someone listening really integrate this knowledge day to day after this deep dive?
Well, the material suggests two really good exercises to kind of train yourself. The first is a self-reflection exercise.
Okay, how does that work?
Think about a recent decision you made, maybe a quick one, where you didn't spend ages weighing things up.
Like an impulse buy or reacting to a headline.
Yeah, something like that. A relatively simple, quick decision. Now, look back at it through the lens of the biases we've discussed.
Okay.
Can you spot an anchor that might have swayed you? Did you rely heavily on one really memorable piece of info? The availability heuristic? Were you mainly looking for details that backed up your initial feeling confirmation bias?
So kind of dissecting your own recent thought process.
Exactly. The exercise suggests maybe even writing it down. What did you focus on? What alternatives did you ignore? How might a bias have played a role?
Mm-hmm.
Doing this regularly helps train your mind to recognize those automatic pathways. It helps you spot where you might be missing data or deciding based on a shortcut, not the full picture.
That conscious analysis definitely sounds like it would build awareness over time. What's the second exercise?
It's called the Spot It in the Wild assignment. Basically, the challenge is to actively look for examples of these biases out in the world over the next week or so.
Like becoming a bias detective in everyday life.
Kind of, yeah. Try to find maybe one example of each of the main biases we talked about. Where do you see confirmation bias?
A news report only showing one side. A social media post.
Perfect. Where's anchoring? Look at pricing in shops, online deals. Can you spot the availability heuristic?
How the news covers certain things, maybe, making them feel more common.
Exactly. Think about how media coverage might inflate the perceived frequency of certain events.
And the idea is just to notice them and identify which bias it is.
Yeah. The assignment suggests just jotting down a quick note when you spot one. Describe the situation, which bias you think is operating, and importantly, how you recognized it.
Ah, so that reinforces the learning.
Right. That act of deliberate identification makes the concepts more concrete. And crucially, it makes you quicker at recognizing those same patterns when they pop up in your own thinking later on.
Those are really excellent practical ways to take this from just listening to actually doing something with it.
I think so too. We've covered a lot today, explored several really powerful cognitive biases.
These deep-seated mental shortcuts that, yeah, profoundly shape how we see things and the choices we make, often totally under the radar.
Mm-hmm. And as we've seen, just being able to recognize these patterns, just naming them, is such a critical first step.
It gives you that foundation, doesn't it, to maybe pause, question that automatic reaction.
And potentially make more informed choices. Be less swayed unconsciously.
Absolutely. It allows for that moment of reflection.
Which kind of brings us to a final thought to leave people with, drawing straight from the source material.
Okay.
Considering just how pervasive these biases are, really baked into how we think, and given that the source explicitly points out how notoriously difficult it is to truly debias ourselves.
Yeah.
What does that really tell us about the fundamental challenge? The sheer difficulty involved in just trying to think twice or think critically in a world that's just constantly throwing information and, frankly, designed influences at us.